Welcome back everybody. In this video I'll be showing you the basics of rendering. Rendering is not going to be very important if you're solely wanting to know how to create 3D models such as for video game assets, but many people wish to render their models and get a more realistic view of them. I will quickly show you the basics of rendering, and there are 3 quick ways to render your scene. You can either go here to this top menu saying render, and you can simply click render image and it will render. You can go over here to this camera tab and click render here and it will render, or you can use the shortcut key, which is F12, and it will render your scene as well. I usually use the shortcut key since it's much more convenient. And you can either render using the Blender render engine, which is enabled by default, or by using the Cycles render engine, which can be changed up here. Blender render is generally quicker and easier to work with and renders your models a lot faster. Cycles render generates more realistic looking renders and handles lighting a lot better. However, Cycles generally takes longer to render, and there's a lot more to both, but to keep it simple, use Blender render for quick test renders or renders where you don't care too much about the look, and use Cycles for more realistic renders where you care about the final product and especially the lighting in the render. Here under this camera tab, right here, you can change the resolution of your render, which by default should be 1920 by 1080. And here with this percentage, you can either render it at 50% of the resolution just to get a quick render, or if you change it to 100%, it will render the full 1920 by 1080. And you can obviously change that to your liking. You can change the shading options here under shading. Here under performance, you can change the threads used, but by default, Blender should automatically detect the threads that your machine is using. For example, I'm running a quad-core i7 4790K with hyper-threading, so by default, Blender renders with 8 threads for me. The more threads your processor has, the quicker it can render. Here under tile size, you can change the default size of your render. If you're rendering using your GPU, and that option is only available in Cycles, then something around 1024 by 1024 is ideal. If you're rendering using your CPU, something around 16 by 16 is ideal. However, this varies among different machines, so it's best to figure out which settings render the quickest for you. If you're rendering an animation, you can choose the default file type. I'd recommend using PNG so that each individual frame will render a picture, so that if your render crashes, you can simply start off at the frame you left off on. If you choose any of these movie settings, then the render is going to completely render through and is not going to generate any individual photos. So if it crashes anytime during the render and you have one of these movie files selected, then you're going to have to restart the entire render if it crashes. So I would definitely recommend using PNG, which is a good file format for the images. The most important thing to remember when rendering over everything else I've mentioned is that you need a camera in your scene and a light source to illuminate the scene. They should be in your scene by default, and there is much more to rendering, such as cycles nodes and more complicated things, but this covers the basics of rendering. So hopefully you all learned a little bit in this video, and I'll see you in the next one.